Welcome to Amadon Planet. I'm your host, Joel Amadon. Thank you for joining me in this never-ending quest to learn how to teach better. Some of you are like, hey, maybe it did end because you haven't put out an episode for a while. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's dissertation season, it's thesis season, it's semester grind season, but that's okay. We've got an episode today. We've got episode 109 today of the podcast. And on this episode is Jeramy Wallace, who is a return guest to Amadon Planet. And if you just need a little reminder, Jeramy is a professor of English at the College of San Mateo out in California. And on his first visit, he was with another frequent visitor to Amadon Planet, Jeremiah Sims, where they talked about their book, The White Educator's Guide to Equity. You know what? That was a popular episode. A lot of people listened to that episode. So just like you enjoyed that episode because there was lots of energy, great conversation, and also good topics. I think you'll like this conversation as well. Jeramy has a new book out. It's called The People's Stories, Critical Storytelling for Social Justice. I'm kind of excited. Well, no, not kind of. I am excited. About it. In this book, he's weaving together themes that we've discussed on this podcast, whether it be social justice work, the power of story, and then considering what it means to push back against dominant narratives, right? And he's doing it all through this tool that he has put together for teachers to use to advance what they do in the classroom. Sounds perfect for this podcast, right? We're learning how to teach better, and excited to have this conversation, excited to share this conversation. The journey is continuing. The podcast has not ended, just took a little bit of break. And, one of the things we talk about in my classroom is about staying fit. And it was just, hey, just didn't have a couple episodes for a couple of weeks. It's fine. Coming back better than ever. So we're talking about a book. We're talking about Jeramy's book. And so as always, just know that we will obviously not be able to communicate the whole value of his book. Even if we did it, it would be from our perspective. In other words, if you like what you hear, get the book for yourself. So there's a link in the show notes to Jeramy's website where you can purchase the book. There's direct links there. It says books. You can go right there. But you know what? Let's not delay anymore. Here is my conversation with Jeramy Wallace about his new book, The People's Stories, Critical Storytelling for Social Justice. Jeramy Wallace, welcome back to Amadon Planet. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Joel, for having me on again. It's been a while. Hope things are going well.
Little applied mathematics, trying to figure out time zones and stuff like that. So it's all good. Love it. And I know we're all in the silly season with regards to semesters and I know in the academic process. So appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, you too.
And then, but also too, Jeramy, I appreciate you taking the time and effort to put this book together that we're going to talk about in a second. It's The People's Stories, Critical Storytelling for Social Justice. It's beautiful. I mean, I'm not trying to throw some shine and just for shine's sake, but this is, I like it. I like it a lot.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, it was fun to write it. And the kind of fun little fact is that probably a third of it was written while I had COVID too, which is kind of fun. But I don't know if those parts could were noticeable or not. But
well, when it pulled up, I'm wow, this is small text. It's going to take a while to get through. But there's a lot there's a lot there, and so I guess let's start there. So how did this book come to be?
Yeah. So. Couple pieces that the first was that I've been kind of looking at this idea of counter story for several years. When I wrote that book with Jeremiah and Jennifer Taylor Mendoza, Lasana Hotep, and Tabitha Conway, My Need Obligation Gap, I started to toy with counter story as a way of changing academic Senate governance, right? To bring the stories of the students in, especially minoritized students, right?
Right.
In that book, I talk about a Senate that's predominantly white senators talking about equity, right? And kind of questioning the need for it and kind of bringing in the voices of the students. We had that particular year, our student president was an African-American male, and he was as part of that position on the Academic Senate Governing Council. And he actually brought really powerful voice, and that really impacted me. So that was kind of where I kind of really started to think about this idea of counter story. it made its way into the White Educator's Guide, the other book I did with Jeremy, which we talked about like a year ago, I think, right?
Yeah.
And so like kind of thinking about that through those books, I wanted to start bringing it into the classroom a little bit more. Asia Martinez, who's a professor at the University of North Texas, was kind of the first person to actually write a book about counter story,
Right.
as a method and methodology. And when I was using her book for a couple of years, but the problem with that book, it's a great book, but the problem is that it is written by a English compositionist whose job it is to teach future compositionists. And that's kind of the audience of the book. It's really meant for graduate students. So my students were struggling with it, and so after a couple years, I was like, man, I got to like kind of find a way to make this content more accessible for the students. And so the book came out of me trying to create a book that my 18-year-old freshman students could access. But also, like, part of it, and we can talk about this a little bit later too, is that like there's a lot of like little kind of theories and frameworks that I'm trying to play with as a scholar as well that I embedded in there, right? Like, I haven't seen a lot of literature where like Marxist theory, right, is alongside of critical race theory outside of stuff like what that Jeremiah is writing for the most part, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, even too, just thinking of what you're talking about with your audience, like and I was looking at some of the stuff that I was exposed to as a graduate student, but yet in a very approachable way. And like, that's a cool part. Like it feels like you're bridging that space of like, hey, this is heady stuff, but at the same time, it's accessible, which that's a tough balance to capture.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting because I think like our students, especially our students of color and our students from other minoritized groups, like they know about this stuff, right? Because like counter story itself is like so culturally embedded in those communities, right? And so they know about this idea of counter story, but I feel like not a lot of them have like the verbiage for it, or like the words for it. And so I think kind of taking like, maybe graduate level concepts, but like kind of describing them in a way that students recognize, right, in their own kind of cultures and experiences. Like
naming the things like they've already been exposed to. That's like, hey, this is what it took me, Joel Amadon, I had to go all the way to describe things that people are experiencing in their everyday lives, right? And so but and that gets it like in just by happenstance, the last few episodes of this podcast have talked about the power of story, right? So even JJ Peterson, we're talking about the power of story through marketing, right? Inviting people into a story, whether it's like in an Apple product or buying a lawn service or whatever. Like people have recognized story there, or even with TED Talks, a lot of the best TED Talks invite people in to a story, like Sir Ken Robinson talking about the kid that's drawing and like enjoying God and like nobody knows what God looks like. And like the kid says, well, you will in a minute, like, and just talking about creativity. But then also too, we had Sarah Sundling Blackburn coming on, and she has part of this Race to Truth series where she wrote a book on Chinese exclusion in the Chinese American story, but like telling the stories of Chinese Americans and like how because those stories are usually not shared, even in an American history class, those stories are not typically shared, right? Of these experiences that are part of the American story, right? And so what is it about you're kind of getting at it. What is the power of story, like from your perspective?
Well, I like, as I mentioned in the opening to the book, it's like one of the most fundamental aspects of being human. I mean, we've been telling stories pretty much as long as we've existed as Homo sapiens, I kind of invite the students in the book to kind of think about what like a campfire looked like for, men and women 150,000 years ago when like we had the most like basic phonemes, right? Like basically just like kind of grunts to a certain extent. But I can almost guarantee that they were by that fire, like telling each other stories, right? And communicating with each other in some way, right? And so it is embedded in this idea of like human culture, and it's like it's through stories that we that we understand the world around us, and it's been that way forever. I mean, I think some could argue that maybe during the Enlightenment and scientific revolution, that maybe we started to see like an objective world. But I think we know at this point that even a lot of that objective knowledge that came about during that time and, up to the present is really subjective.
Yeah.
Right.
But even thinking like the power of story, and then not only the power of story, so then you kind of add in another layer on there, but like the power of what story is told and heard is that there lies, it seems like the power of what you're getting at here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So one of those like grad level concepts that I wanted to introduce the students to are the idea of like ideological state apparatuses, hegemony, right? So we talk about like Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, Louis Althusser. And it's like the power of story is like, it's the power of story to move us, but also the power of story to like mold our societies, right? And the stories that tend to shape our societies are the ones told by those with the power, right? I guess that'd be like capital P power, right? And those stories are generally passed off as objective knowledge, right? I mean, we're both educators. We know how the education system tells a certain story, right? That tends to be revolved around like Eurocentric knowledge, capitalism, neoliberalism, things like that, right? But those stories are taken as truth, right? And so, so one of the things that I want the students to understand in the book is that like all the knowledge that we have, all these stories they're created, right? There's a knowledge construction process. Nothing's a given,
right? Yeah, and it seemed like your title of your book, "The People's Stories," is a nod to Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, and like talking about that, like just, I mean, for those that maybe have not been exposed, and actually you have not been exposed to that book, talk about that, like what that offers versus what we've experienced in possibly traditional classrooms.
Yeah. So Howard Zinn's book, The People's History, is really telling the story of American history from the perspective of those who have traditionally been excluded from the American history curriculum, right? So from perspective of immigrants, people of color, women. I can't remember if he gets into like the LGBTQ community, or I'm sure he does
later in edition.
Yeah. But he's really trying to like tell or describe American history through the eyes of the people that he argues like really built the nation, right? Or kind of the backbone of the nation. So I kind of saw this like book and this project as kind of being a very similar kind of mission, right? Let's highlight the stories of the people whose stories are not usually told in a classroom.
Yeah. And I remember the first time I picked up that book, and you're told all these stories about who Christopher Columbus is back in the day. And like, even too, thinking about like you having like the little, almost like whatever clip art smiley face with like the hat on. And like, you see that as like in elementary school, but then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, let's read in this story. Like you hear like the awful stuff that you weren't exposed to that story. Right. And as I think in Good Will Hunting, he talked about Howard Zinn's book. He's like, that book will blow your mind. I'm like, well, yeah, because it's these offers a difference. It pushes on and hits you in like the brain of like what you thought you knew, because you'd never questioned those stories, right? And so there's often a counter story.
Well, and then I think like just this idea of power too, and this is probably like a slightly off topic, but just like the power dynamics of the classroom, right? Like when we learn about Christopher Columbus, like we're learning about it from somebody who we respect and who has a certain gravitas to them, right? It's like, so if a teacher tells you like Christopher Columbus, you discovered America, and like we're here, like the U.S. is here because of him, and et cetera, et cetera. It's like, oh yeah, it's like that. That's how it was. Yeah, cool. Like, and we're never told the other side of that.
Yeah. Like he founded it like a company, right? No.
Exactly. Yeah, right. CEO of Christopher Columbus.
That's right. Yeah. So like when you talked about this, so in this kind of gets at it. You had that quote in the first chapter talking about this war between stories, and so like thinking about how do you get like position this, because like you're entering this into like you said, talking to 18-year-olds, and like you're basically helping them step into this space, right? And so I don't know, like, what does that look like, both in the book, but maybe even in your own teaching?
Yeah. So that's a quote from Richard Delgado, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he, in his 1989 article, where he really like started like put a terminology to this idea of counter story. Um, I start with the students, like with some of the, I mean, like I feel like the Christopher Columbus mythology, like I'm sure it's still promoted in the education system, but I feel like students for the most part kind of have a grasp
Yeah.
on that mythology. So I try to hit them with like the civil rights mythology,
Mm.
right, which is a part of the book, right? And so I really
Right.
I kind of focus on the Rosa Parks story, the Martin Luther King story, the Malcolm X story,
Yeah.
and we talk about like what have you learned about these individuals, right? And most of my students, I do get some students like, oh yeah, that's the story of, like I did know that Rosa Parks was not an old lady, and that I knew that she was an activist who like was trying to stir up good trouble, and but most of my students are like, oh, I never knew that. Like I always thought about this other version here, and so we talk about that majoritarian narrative, as Delgado calls it, in class, and then we just start looking like we look at a podcast by David Icard, who talks about the Rosa Parks story. He's an African American studies professor. He has a TED talk about the true story of Rosa Parks. That might actually be the title of it. But it's just like kind of like asking the students to kind of dig into their schema for the narratives they've been told about these topics, and then to discuss with them and show them these counter stories. Right. And then kind of getting at that larger question of why do these two accounts of Rosa Parks, for example, exist in the first place? Why is it that we're taught that Rosa Parks was this old, frail lady who was kind of an accidental activist, when in reality she was not old at all, and she was an activist, right? And she come from a long line of activists, and that she was ready to be arrested and to start this movement, right? Like, why is there this broader war between these stories? And so that kind of gets us into like these really cool discussions about power.
Yeah.
Right. No. And yeah.
It's like stripping all this, context around it, reduces the power of not only her, but the movement that was happening around her, and like all the organization that occurred. Like, yeah. One of my favorite books is The Long Haul, the story about Miles Horton and the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which, talks about all the community development training that went on, in support of everything, and just all the mechanisms that existed around, even that story. Or like one of my Bob Moses, who not only is a civil rights leader, but then also in the math ed world, is like, he talked about he had the algebra project, and like that people just don't know those stories around it, or even too like some of the stories around folks and things that have happened in Mississippi. You wonder, and I'm not in social studies classrooms every day, but like hearing like, well, what is being told or not told, and that selection of stories is that's where the power exists, right? And how they're told.
Yeah, and I think we're also like in this really interesting moment as professors and scholars, where like this like rewriting of history is like out in the open now. I mean, like you have states like Florida where they're very explicitly saying like, we don't want to talk about slavery in our textbooks, and it's like, oh, like I tell I show my students that stuff, and like, oh, that's where it's coming from, right? Like they kind of like the covers off a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, and even too, like just going back to the power of story, like, I'm dealing with teacher education, where it's like, what is the story of what education, well, even to think about math education, what does math education look like? Where it was very like, teacher down directed, like, the teacher has somehow gotten this knowledge from the math gods and is disseminating it to you because you are blank slates. And like, it has to be teacher led. It has to be at the, up at the board, leading everything and telling you like, I've got this algorithm that you've never seen before, and I'm going to expose you to how to solve problems. And it's, it's like very one directional, versus like the counter narrative is like, hey, let's think about that. You are bringing in context for that, which you're a living, breathing person. You're doing math all the time, and like now let's offer, like you're saying before about let's bring language around things that you're already experiencing, that you're already doing, that you're already making decisions around. Like you're problem solving every single day, and now we can use those as assets to explore and learn more about this topic together. And so it's like there's these competing narratives that we're trying to help them see, like there's a counter to what you're already experiencing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, one of the like the really important components of critical race storytelling is this idea of like experiential knowledge, right? That the students do come in our classrooms with various experiences, especially like racialized experiences, gendered experiences, right? And that it like the most effective way to promote, to like execute your pedagogy or your curriculum is to tap into that knowledge, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I have a colleague at one of our sister colleges, Kenyatta Weathersby, who he's a math teacher. And Jeremiah knows him. I'm sure you should like try to connect with him, but he teaches math through the prism of like the Flint water crisis.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so like, and the students are super engaged with that because they want to know more about that. But yeah, like using math and statistics as a way to like look at it is like really fascinating. I think it's really engaging for the students.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think Julia Aguirre and I think Francis Harper. I can't remember. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But they did something just on because I did some work up there. Like just it was the crisis around. Hey, they got all this bottled water. Great. Now you have to deal with a bunch of empty bottles of water, and like thinking about just even from a volume perspective. What did that mean? Like, what was the difference between, having these full, empty bottles of water, but they're like full versus like it crushing them, and thinking about how do we store, what do we do with all this stuff? So not only a crisis, but the ramifications of dealing with the crisis. Like there was a lot of math there, but then, helping students maybe even make sense of this thing that's happening, like from within using mathematics to what, as Gus Haynes talk about, analyze and question the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so, another thing is, and I wonder if this happens when you're thinking about your when you're dealing with your students and you're thinking about implementing the book, or we'll talk more specifics about the book in a second. But I was thinking about, I had my own narrative about myself, like a self narrative, like a self story that you're telling. So like, I was a first generation college student, like, didn't have, someone ahead of me to like show the way or like how to, apply to college or write up, fulfill the FAFSA, all that stuff. And like, this narrative around, like, man, it's really tough. But then like being then exposed to different stories and then being shown like all the privilege, right, that existed around that story. And like, and it almost like it changed my own personal narrative, and seeing like, man, I had a lot of just of these doors that I didn't notice that were just all open for me in this way. Even like to the point where even as a math teacher, when I struggled, like to, like, oh man, I had a tough time in this one class, but I look up and I could see the person at the front of the classroom looked like me, and almost like with my gray hair and my glasses now, almost exactly like me, And so like having that as like that shifting narrative. And like, I wonder, like, are you dealing with students or when they start to think about their own stories, like, and through some of these different lenses that have a shifting perspective, like even if they're, whatever their story, like they all of a sudden they see differences in like how they're experiencing the world. I don't know. Do you see that when kids are in your class?
Yeah. We have talked about that this past fall. My class was really focused on environmental justice. And one of the things that we realized early on in the semester is that the students in my class were not disproportionately impacted by climate change. Right. And so we were, even though it wasn't really racial experience, most of the students were students of color, but there was a class privilege there. And so we kind of had to redirect the conversation a little bit and say like, okay, like how do we use like this critical race storytelling lens when you're not part of the counter story. Right.
Yeah.
And so we did have to approach it as like members of like what Delgado calls like the in group, right? Those with privilege and power. We had some interesting conversations about like, performative allyship and virtue signaling and things like that. And ultimately, like we kind of had like the discussion through the semester came about like flipping the mirror on oneself and like recognizing one's privileges, developing like empathy, right? And compassion for those who are disproportionate by climate change, and then kind of thinking about actual ways in which those who are part of the in group can engage in storytelling that promotes social justice and doesn't perpetuate it through things like virtue signaling and Me Tooism and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I guess too, like when you entered in those conversations, there's we talk about it as like when I talk about math, we're dealing with context, we're dealing with students thinking, and there's this open space where things can happen. We call it kind of a messy space, and like so, like you're opening up that space for things to happen, and students bring different perspectives and how you're dealing with it. Like it can be like, oh, how are we going to deal with this? And like you're describing some of those situations, but then also too must make for such a richer classroom where students are leaning in, and even though there's might be some uncomfortable, like man, that must make for a much more engaging learning experience for them to use what they're doing within something that's so meaningful to their context and their situation.
Yeah. And one of the things I like about like using story in the classroom also is that I think it helps students or people like us, right, who are very privileged, right, to like not take it so personally, right? I think that's one of the critiques of critical race theory right now by the right in particular.
Wait, there's critiques?
Right. But it's like this, like all these like critics of critical race theory like think that it's all about making white folks feel bad about being white, right? And there is discomfort there, and there should be some discomfort, right? There has to be a little bit of friction, but like most of us aren't actively promoting systems of white supremacy, right? We're complicit in them, but we're not the architects of it, right? And so when you start looking at like stories as being these things that we're told as white folks or people in privileged positions, right? And you kind of like start to like disembody that story a tiny bit, then you can, I think, start breaking those stories down a little bit more, right? Because it becomes less about who you are as an individual, more about how society has shaped you through story.
Yeah. And like you're kind of making that differentiation between like, are we racist, non-racist, where you're just kind of going along with the system versus the anti-racist? Like how do you push against that? Like that's the fear around anti-racism and like, are we teaching it to kindergartners? And like, we can put people at ease. We're not doing that. But what we can do is like, how are we, I mean, what kind of stories are we offering students in class? Can kids like, even just say like, and this is something my students here have learned from actually our previous guest, Dr. Sarah Sundling Blackburn, where she's like, who's represented in your classroom? And can those kids see themselves in the stories that they get to read in the class, or that are on the bookshelf, that are being shared? And, I mean, just even from that small level, like you're starting to already push on something that some people might say, well, why do we need to do that? No, representation matters, right?
Yeah. And I bet that's so powerful for the young kids too.
Oh yeah. Well, and for our teachers too, because like, again, a lot of times they're coming from a similar sort of background where, they were represented in Frozen, right? But they didn't, now that like they're seeing like, oh, wow, this is, how do I push against this? And it's like the first step. How do I push against this? And so, but I guess that's something that, and is there a moment when you're saying like, well, do you have a moment in the class where you're like, hey, this is, just so you know, this is what critical race theory is. We're getting towards that with what we're doing here. And it's like that education moment. I don't know, like how does that come about within what you do?
Yeah, we definitely talk about it early. because our students see they see this stuff in social media
Oh
and
yeah.
maybe the news. They know there's conversations around it. They don't have a great idea of what it is. And so early on, I kind of go through like critical theory as like a tradition
Yeah.
first, and then I get the critical race theory after that. But I really try to hit on like what we were just talking about. Critical race theory is not trying to make anybody feel bad,
Right.
right? It's kind of disembodying this like privilege a little bit and trying to break it down in this case through storytelling, but also I kind of explained the roots of critical race theory in the legal field, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like the original crits were simply just trying to create a more just legal system. Like,
Yeah.
there's nothing radical about that, There were a bunch of lawyers saying like we need to make the system work better for everybody, right?
Yeah.
We need equal justice under the law, right? And I think when students are like, oh, like because I'll tell them like critical race theorists, like they're trying to create a more equitable and socially just system, right? The Kimberly Crenshaws, the Derek Bells of the world, like they they they're American and patriotic enough to want to dedicate their life and their scholarship to making this country better.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing more American and patriotic than that,
Yeah.
right? They're not trying to tear anything down. They're trying to make it better, build it up, And so we do talk about that really in the semester to kind of like dispel some of the myths of it being like this boogeyman that's trying to like destroy America or something.
Exactly. So you've obviously been thinking really deeply about this, but now you put this into a book, right? You put this into a book and put it out into the world for other teachers to use, like where you saw the need and you saw like I needed to put something together that my students can approach the content that you're trying to teach before, and now you're putting it into other people's hands. So it's like that. Now it's kind of maybe you lose a little control of it. So like now that it's out into the world, how would you suggest other teachers incorporate this book into their own teaching?
Yeah, I would start with storytelling in a general sense. Chapter one's all about that, like kind of the origins of stories, the fact that we're surrounded by stories, right? I think popular culture and popular media are great entries into this conversation.
Yeah.
Talking about like film or music, TV, social media, like the things that students are familiar with.
Yeah.
Right. And then kind of taking up another notch and saying, okay, like how do these popular media or mediums, like how do they promote some kind of power dynamic, right? And so that's kind of intentionally bringing in like media or literature, right, that does that, and asking, like for me, the Rosa Parks story is kind of like the foundational story that we talk about in my class, right? And then letting that kind of propel the conversation into this idea of like power, right? Majoritarian dominant narratives, how those are transmitted through media and literature, what counter stories are, who's telling counter stories, right? How counter stories operate. But I guess kind of like to answer your question, like I think it's like, again, like students have this knowledge, like tap into that knowledge and then just kind of help guide them into this like larger academic conversation about storytelling, critical race storytelling.
Yeah, I like how I think you have like an initial paragraph in the text where you describe like, yeah, here's a day in the life, but it's like, you're looking at social media, you're looking at like you're surrounded by story throughout your day. It might not be a great story, but it's like you're surrounded by it, right? And so like now, like how do we think about that more deeply, right? And like analyze it from different perspectives, and then also push into it, right? And participate within it. I even was thinking like, and lately I've been just thinking a lot just with all the landscape as it is, like, and as you're talking about this idea of counter story and counter storytelling, I was thinking back to the story of the Good Samaritan. I don't know about that, about the Good Samaritan in the Bible, where, I mean, and our friend Jeremiah might be thinking about this too, but think about, that was a story told by Jesus about Samaritans who were like, a marginalized population within that context of the Bible, and saying that the hero of the story was from this population, like the Good Samaritan that we think like, oh yeah, I'm being a Good Samaritan, was like from a marginalized population within the Bible that hey, who's the hero? Who's acting appropriately in the story of who actually helped this person? It was the Samaritan. The marginalized population was the hero of this story, and like offering this counter story to then help. I think you quote unquote reevaluate social hierarchy, right? And like who is supposed to be the person that helps, and it was a pastor or a priest or something like that passed and just left the person for dead, and it's like that idea. And so like we're surrounded by these stories, but then also too, these ideas of counter storytelling that, that we accept and everything, but we might maybe even miss some of the moments that are there, because we've kind of incorporated into this, like, I don't know, dominant sort of storytelling that we miss some of that.
Interesting. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. But you're right. I'm sure there's lots of examples of counter stories that kind of go over a lot of folks' heads, right?
Yeah, that we miss it, right?
Yeah.
Like
well, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you tell people like, hey, Jesus was an anti-racist. Did you know that?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, but thinking about, the idea of, helping, you're saying taking the energy of the students and using that, and then now talking about this book and using it in their own teaching. But then also you wouldn't just say like, hey, grab this book out of the box and just go, right? So like you probably have helping teachers like best prepare to use the book. What would you suggest that teachers do in order to be prepared to take this perspective, which might be different for them in this sort of content?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. The lead up to writing this book was a lot of background in critical race theory, educational equity, social justice, racial justice, for at least a decade, right? Yeah. And so I don't think that a teacher needs a decade of work in racial justice in order to teach this book, but I do think that teachers should look at the literature around anti-racism, right? Maybe look at some information about what critical race theory is.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's the thing. That's the reality, is that like a lot of folks, like if you were just pick this book up and walk into a classroom and you don't know much about this, like students are going to challenge the ideas. Right. I mean, the book talks about Karl Marx. Right. And, it talks about like critical race theory, and like both of those, like some students like don't jive with that. Right. And they're going to challenge you. And so you have to be able to like talk about critical race theory in an informed way, so that when students bring up those objections, you can kind of like talk them down a little bit, right? And help them better understand what those theories are. So I think like reading The White Educator's Guide to Equity, right?
There you go.
Last book, little plug for that. The book that Jeremiah and I wrote previously to that, Mind the Obligation Gap, which is also for educators as well.
Yeah.
I think just gives a really good solid foundation for this work, right? And then.
And you've cited a lot of Gloria Ladson Billings too. Like, I mean, she wrote The Dream Keepers, but then even she's wrote some later stuff and has actually some pretty good YouTube videos out there, especially when some of the backlash against CRT was happening, like that, just explaining some of those things from an educator's perspective as well. Yeah.
Yeah. She's essentially like the godmother of CRT in education. So like she's the one that really kind of facilitate that jump from legal studies over to educational research. And she has lots.
I think Bill Tate too is now the president of LSU. I think they wrote the article.
Yep.
What is critical race theory doing in a good,
nice field like education?
Yeah. She's always good with titles.
But that's such an accessible article, and so that would be a great one to read before teaching this book.
Yeah. So what, I guess too, we're opening up this conversation a little bit, but what else do you want people to understand about the book? I mean, we talked a little bit about the features where you have these embedded definitions, where I was learning some nice words about that I can incorporate into my writing. But what else, like, and you talk about embedding stories, but what else do you want people to know about this book and how some, you know, maybe some thoughtfulness that you put into some of the features of it or what you've incorporated in it.
Yeah, I want like a big portion of the book is about like academic research. And I want students and even folks who are teaching this to understand that stories do have an important role in academic research. The methodology that I borrow from is one created by Terry Yasso and Daniel Solorzano, critical race methodology, right, which very intentionally integrates the stories and experiential knowledge of the research participants and the scholars themselves into understanding like, you know, phenomenology essentially. Mm-hmm. Right. So, you know, it's kind of pushing back against that, the great divide theory, right? That like stories belong over here, but it's not in academia. Right. Yeah. And so I very early on, I want students to realize that like, no, stories do have a place in academia, in our research, and that even that stuff that we consider objective knowledge is itself a story, right? Like, you know, so I think that's probably one of the bigger things I want students to understand from the book.
Yeah, no, that's good. And even like, I was thinking about my own academic writing. Most of them have like some sort of vignette to kind of center it. Like we did an article, like Becky Smith and Anne-Marie Marshall. We wrote this book on just a module we used in our math methods class. And it was basically like agent of change or instrument of inequity. And it was about like, we were trying to think like, well, we know that we need to do something towards moving towards more equitable outcomes for our students. And we have an opportunity and an audience with elementary math teachers to, hey, you're going to be, and actually there's a story there too. You're going to be entering into a student's story as either a helper or a herder. It's not going to be neutral, right? You're going to do something. You're going to be an agent of change or an instrument of inequity. And thinking about that, but then we started that whole article with like looking at the syllabus and thinking, well, what can I do that's different? Because I've been doing the same thing, and I think I'm perpetuating versus I'm hurting rather than helping. And so what do I do? And so that, I don't know, that there is something there about that, embracing that power and thinking about not only where does your research fit in, but then how can you use story within your research as a part of it as well.
Yeah, and that's such a great example too, because it does highlight a disconnect between like what published researchers are putting out there and what we're teaching our students about research.
Yeah.
Right. Because I feel like story is like pretty accepted in a lot of disciplines for peer-reviewed scholarly, you know, work now. Right. Mm-hmm. But we're still teaching our students that you can't use stories.
Yeah.
You know, in writing, you know, it's crazy.
Yeah. There's for my math nerds out there, there's a classic research article by this guy named Earl Wanger, and he interviewed this guy named Benny. I think it was a pseudonym, or this kid named Benny who was successful with this curriculum. And this guy just interviewed Benny, and Benny just told the story about all the things he knew about fractions, which were just off the wall. But it was because he was in this like teacher-proof curriculum that like all they did was assess, and if you pass the assessment like by 80%, you moved on to the next thing. And so you just interviewed like, what do you know about fractions? And it was so wild. And it was like, that was this one story of what this kid knew, or what this kid knew about fractions, like basically like, okay, that curriculum is gone. And it was from the power of a single interview with this kid. And it was just like, it was amazing what it was able to do. And that was like, it was a classic, because not many people would have accepted a single case, right? Like a single interview as being that powerful, but here it was, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was, I'll put a link to that one. It's a great read, but it's like also, you know, we can open up ideas about what research is, right? And so maybe that's a counter story in of itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I showed my students Derek Bell's early work, right? Mm-hmm. Like I excerpt one of them in the book itself, but yeah. Like it's the one in the book is from his book, And We Are Not Saved. But that article that they read was originally published in the Harvard Law Review. Mm. Right. And it's about time travel.
Yeah.
You know, and I tell my students like the Harvard Law Review published this article on time travel. Right. Like there's all the evidence you need right there that like story is a powerful form of scholarship.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. gosh, I wish I could remember which article. There was an article. It was like a kind of an autoethnography, but it didn't have a single citation in it. But
Oh, wow.
it was like this is research, right? It's still
Mm-hmm.
research, you know. Um, but yeah, this is good. This is great, Jeremy. Anything else you want to do to talk about the book, promote the book? I got one more question for you, but I want to wrap up. Anything else with the book? You got any other podcast episodes or anything else coming out?
This is it, man. This book is, it's pretty, I mean, when I was working at the publisher, they basically said you have to put this into a category.
Yeah.
And so it is a composition textbook.
Yeah.
As you know, at the end of each chapter, it has like writing activities, right?
Yep.
And how to like format essays and how to use citations. But I do feel like the information content is useful to multiple disciplines. It doesn't have to be taught as a composition textbook, but the fact that it is a composition textbook, I feel like has made it very niche, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I'll just add about the textbook as well is that like I'm also playing with a lot of like theories that I'm interested in, like bringing together Marxist theory and critical race theory, ISAs and critical race theory, sociolinguistics, writing studies and rhetoric. Like there's a lot of like really nascent theories in that book. And I also just want to invite like scholars who are reading this, like kind of play with those a little bit more and build them up, because it is a first edition. I still think, I appreciate all your kind words about earlier. I still think there's a lot of like holes that need to be filled. I was saying at a conference a couple weeks ago when I was talking about the book that, there's a chapter about creative writing counter story. I feel like I hope that somebody could take that and just write a whole book about it.
Yeah.
Because I think there's so much there that I just wasn't able to explore yet. So
was that, I mean, do you see that as maybe this is like the beginning for to go deep into several chapters like that?
I hope so. I hope it's a conversation starter for scholars as much as a tool for students.
Yeah. Well,
maybe even a conversation starter for the students.
Well, and that's what I like. I mean, you did talk about this as a tool, but as like a textbook, but it's also a guide, right? Like a textbook and a guide. And I like that. I like that. And then just even too of opening up perspectives on what you can do with academic research, right? And like that's great. And again, playing around with theories, like it's just having a conversation around theoretical frameworks and how to use those within. And I think, again, I'm more of a math guy. I think having someone that's gifted in writing like you would just be able to lay that out. Almost like, you see what Jeramy's saying there? Go with that. Yeah, but that's excellent. So you're very experienced. Well, and also too, I think you're a great follow on LinkedIn. You're very good. You're very active and doing some different things there. So I like that. So I'm gonna put a link to that so you can check you out there. But what is something that you've done recently as an experienced teacher? What is something you have recently learned to help you in teaching better? This podcast is all about learning how to teach better. What's something you've learned lately?
I love that question. So the one that I've been thinking a lot about, and I think I want to like develop into like something, is this idea of what I'm calling think tank pedagogy. And it kind of comes from this book. It's where essentially what I want to do is I want my students, when they walk into the classroom, to know that they're knowledge producers. Right. And I want to get away from a classroom where I'm like, okay, we're going to read like these 3 books and we're going to write these 4 or 5 essays about these topics, and like feels very contrived sometimes. This is kind of also just as a little aside, like a response to AI, right? Yeah. I think AI is catching up to all that stuff, right? And so, like, how do you do curriculum or curricula and knowledge construction in a way that like AI is obsolete in the classroom, right? And so, what I'm doing is I want to frame my classrooms around a question that people haven't really thought about yet. Right. And so that was what I started last fall with that class on environmental justice. There's not a lot of writing out there that has taken environmental and climate justice and layered on critical race storytelling. Right. And so like I tell my students being a semester, I was like, we're kind of going into uncharted waters a little bit. Right. And we're kind of going to go down this river together and think about this together. And so it's not me like depositing knowledge or even forcing them into this like template essay reading assignments. More like, here's a question that we're going to think about this semester, and let's just kind of see where it goes. right?
That's awesome.
And students came up with some cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
In fact, I'll send you a link to a paper that a group of students wrote about the education system and environmental justice.
Nice. Well, I mean, just as you're describing that, and maybe even as the listeners are hearing, they're probably just like leaning in a little bit, like, oh, wow, like to not only, to hear something like that's exciting, but then also like, whoa, I have a role in this. That's pretty cool. I remember as a doc seminar in Wisconsin, the people that ran it, Richard and Erica Halverson, they were like, hey, we're not just going to have a seminar where you're just going to hear us talk and have, smart people talk at you or whatever. Like, we want to produce something together. And it was like it was so exciting to be like, wait a second, you think that I could have something to offer? And that was the coolest, like, to be able to do that. And the fact is you're doing this in your classes. That's pretty awesome. Well, I love it. Thank you. That's a great one. All right. Well, Jeramy, thank you so much for not only for spending time with us here today, for sharing your work and everything that you're producing, but then also just putting this together and putting it out to the world. Like you said, 10 years of thinking about these things and shaping it and putting it out to the world. That's not taking a risk, but then also it's a gift to anyone that gets to interact with it. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's always so much fun to chat with you.
Yeah, it's a good end of the week. Thank
you, Jeramy. Cool. Thank you, Joel.
Wow. There's my conversation with Jeramy. A little bit transparency. So I record the stuff that goes before and after the conversations have happened. So a lot of time I've just listened to it again, and sometimes I'm like, wow. Like, and again, I kind of get meta about the podcast every now and then. I'm like, it's pretty cool that people come here to share stuff. I get to benefit from having the conversation. And I love then also knowing that there's other people out there that are going to benefit from hearing like the brilliance of Jeramy. And then also too, like maybe some people, there's people out there that weren't aware of his book, are now aware of his book and can use it to help other people out in the world tell some of their counter stories, right? That counter storytelling. That's cool. So just, I say it all the time. I'm excited to share. I am excited. I'm excited to have the conversation. I'm excited to listen to it again. I'm excited to share it. Now, another thing I'm excited about is this new additional section of the podcast. Like, some of you might be here just for the conversation. That's fine. You can hit pause. But maybe some of you you're walking the dog. You're not done with the walk yet. That's fine. And I want to add this new thing. I'm going to call it the album of the episode. I'm not going to do it yet. I'm going to do it on the next one. But I just want to explain why I want to do it. One, there is a teaching reason for it. So there's research behind if you have a better relationship with those that you're teaching, right? Students or listener, whatever, right? If there's a better student-teacher relationship, better learning can happen. And some of that relationship, it doesn't have to necessarily be, like a knowledgeable exchange. Like, well, what I mean by that is, like, a teacher mentions like they have a dog, or they're as I am, an owner of the Green Bay Packers, or they enjoy bike riding, whatever. Like, there's some sort of, or enjoy the outdoors, or enjoy music, or whatever. There's this connection that then gets created between that student and teacher, even if it's not like said, like, no, I currently have a better connection with my teacher. No, it's not. But like, there's a little bit of, I don't know, credit or street cred or whatever. I kind of see it as like a conduit, like those pipes that help deliver like wires from one end of a building to another. Like, a conduit facilitates that connection. I think of these relationship builders as like a conduit. And I wanted to give a little conduit to myself and anyone who might be listening out there. Because there's people that are listening in England and Germany, and there's Colombia. I mean, it's kind of cool when you see where people are listening from. So, like, hey, send an email to the mailbag, joel@AmaZonPlanet.com, if you had a question. I'd love to hear from people from across the globe. Anyway, I wanted to start something with album of the episode. So, like, I've been having a lot of conversations with my son about music because he's gotten full access to Spotify, which is kind of fun. And so he's diving into all this music, and he loves some of the music that I grew up with as a kid. And so we're building a connection that way. And I thought, hey, let's build this connection. So I've had like kind of a little bit of a crisis moment. Like as a kid, you loved a band, and what did you go do? You went and bought their music, right? And I love doing that and getting those albums, those CDs, those tapes, whatever, and playing them. And hey, that's a good hit. That's it. But then as you keep playing from hit to hit in between, like there's this other song that you really got into, and now those three songs, the hit, the other hit, and the one in between, are like intertwined, and you couldn't think of them separately. It's almost like when that one song ends, you're waiting for that new song to begin, even if it's on the radio, right? So just that relationship between a band, a music, and the music that they put out, right, through like those sets of albums. And so, I used to, on social media a little while ago, I used to put out like a song of the day, because I really got enthusiastic about a song, and I do these things where like I'll listen to a song over and over again. I don't know if that's like a focusing mechanism or something, or if it helps me concentrate. I don't know. We're going to get into that. I got a book coming up that we're going to talk about focus. But more and more, I like the album experience. And basically what I'm saying is, when I turned 40, my, I'm quote unquote midlife crisis was to buy a record player. And one of the things I wanted to get into was vinyl records. Because again, that relationship of buying albums from a band was a way of almost like voting for them. Like, hey, I like you. I like what you're doing. I'm supporting you. And like, I was like, how am I doing that? Like, I think about the Avett Brothers. I first saw the Avett Brothers on a Tiny Desk concert from NPR, which is Bob Boylan, who was the head of like All Songs Considered. It was a podcast, but then he would have artists come into the NPR studios, and he had a desk, and he would have them set up behind his desk, and he'd record them doing this concert, a Tiny Desk concert. If you've seen them or you heard them, they're pretty amazing. Anyway, I heard the Avett Brothers, and I heard them play Laundry Room, and I was amazed. I was like, this is unbelievable. I loved it. I loved the passion. I loved the energy. And like what they just did with just, 4 instruments and their voices. It was incredible. And I'd watch that video over and over again. But I realized outside of like going to a concert or two, and one of them I think was free for them because it was for St. Jude. Anyway, I never really like gave them anything. Like they've been giving me all this music, and I listen on streaming. So maybe I'd pay like $1.99 or something. But like other than that, like how am I showing them that I support them and what they do? And then also too, letting them know, keep doing it, right? And the Avett Brothers have this awesome like a documentary about them called May It Last. Judd Apatow did it. We watched it on a date night during the pandemic. It was kind of a fun thing with my wife and I, because we both like the Avett Brothers. Anyway, how am I showing it? So like, you don't really buy CDs anymore, and like I could buy them on iTunes, but I didn't really feel good. So like vinyl records. And so, they put out something like, let's get a record. Avett Brothers got a new album coming out. Let's buy the record. And I love, and going back to that relationship as a child to or a young man, like having a record, having an album, and playing it from cover to cover, and getting that relationship, not just to a song, but to an album, and thinking about what are some of my favorite albums of all time. And then we just want to share them. And I'm going to call it the album of the episode, because I love music. I want to share that with you. And then maybe that's about developing a relationship. Maybe it leads to also little stories. Those stories lead to other connections, and then we become better because we're more connected, even across a kind of a one-way street here. But though you can interact via the mailbag, joel@amazonplanet.com. But then we get to develop a better relationship. I get to have fun, talking about music that I love. And then maybe you get exposed to some music, right? Just like you get exposed to some great ideas through the initial conversation. So we'll have an album of the episode, and that'll come out every time we have an episode, which hopefully, given my conversation at the beginning of this episode, we talked about having a little break. It'll be 2 weeks from now, because we're on a 2-week, like to be on a 2-week rotation. So next time you can look forward to album of the episode. I got an idea about what I want to do. It's an oldie, but it's one of my favorites, and has some deep connections to me and even to my dog. And I'll explain that in a bit. So that's going to do it for this episode of Amazon Planet. Show notes can be found at amazonplanet.com/episode 109. Now, for those of you looking for ways to support the podcast, you can subscribe, rate, review, and share the episode, which will allow more people looking for similar content to find it. If you're a Spotify listener, please follow us and then rate us on Spotify. I'm now distributing through Spotify, so we're kind of more sensitive to those. But hey, wherever you listen to it, it's fine. And if you hear something that you're like, hey, I know, like for example, this episode, I know someone in a writing and rhetoric department, which I do, and I'm going to share this episode with them, so that maybe this could be something that could be useful to them, because I think Jeramy's created something that I think is really cool, and I'd like to share that creation with others. That's why we do the podcast, and maybe why you listen to the podcast. In addition, you can subscribe to the Amazon Planet download, which contains teaching resources and updates from Amazon Planet. So anywhere you go on the AmazonPlanet.com, you'll see buttons to join the email list. Do that, and you'll get access to the download. We don't send it out often, but when we do, we think it's something worthy of sharing. You can also submit a question, comment, or suggestion to the mailbag by sending an email to joel@amazonplanet.com. In addition, I'm always looking for opportunities to work with others who are looking to lead people to love others through teaching. So if you have an event or opportunity to share, you can either send an email to joel@amazonplanet.com or head to amazonplanet.com/about to fill out the request to call form. Finally, just want to thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for spending time on Amazon Planet. Thanks to Jeramy Wallace for sharing his time and expertise. Thanks for putting that book out into the world. Thanks, Jeramy, for that. Thanks to Matt Mifflin for the episode, for the music in this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there learning to teach better, do the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you have been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do. Peace.